So I want you to imagine, just for a second, walking into a massive, high-end commercial plant nursery.
Oh, I love those places.
Right. And you're surrounded by just thousands of dollars of inventory. We're talking meticulously cultivated, genetically uniform, exotic flowers.
All sitting in those perfect little neat plastic pots.
Exactly. Categorized by sun tolerance, all stamped with barcodes, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
But instead of grabbing a shopping cart and, loading up, you walk right past the cash registers. You ignore the big, beautiful displays, and you just drop to your knees in the gravel parking lot.
In the parking lot.
In the parking lot. And you start carefully extracting the weeds that are just growing out of the cracks in the concrete.
That is, it sounds completely unhinged.
It does. But today we're actually looking at a dispatch from a lifelong gardener who plans to do exactly that. And we are going to figure out why this sort of bizarre botanical heist actually makes perfect sense.
It really is kind of the ultimate paradox of our modern consumer culture, because we naturally assume that if something has value, someone has already figured out a way to put a price tag on it.
Right. Oh, definitely.
But this particular deep dive we're doing today, it forces us to completely reevaluate how we assign worth, not just in landscaping, but literally in everything we walk past on a daily basis.
Yeah, and the source material we are unpacking today is, well, it's very brief, but it is incredibly dense. It's a journal entry published today, July 21st, 2026.
Fresh off the press.
Exactly. It comes from a writer named Ang under the overarching title, Notes on Gardening.
Yeah.
And the specific entry we were looking at is part 962.
Which is just staggering.
I mean, before we even get to the actual plant that Ang is so focused on, we really have to talk about that number. Part 962. If this were a television show and, each journal entry was an episode, we'd be jumping straight into the middle of, season 40-something.
Yeah, the meta context here is just so crucial to understanding the whole thing. Ang actually references this immense timeline right at the top of the post.
Yeah, bringing up an early indulgence in gardening, quote, so many moons ago.
Right, all the way back in part 38. And then there's another mention of a subsequent encounter with this plant in part 890. So this is, frankly, it's a multi-generational epic. But the generations are just different phases of one single person's understanding of their environment.
See, I want to dig into the psychology of that timeline for a minute.
Yeah.
Because most of us, we don't do anything 962 times with deliberate, focused intention.
Very true.
Like, when you or I start a hobby, we are looking at the macro level.
Yeah, the big picture.
Exactly. You decide to start gardening, and you immediately want a giant showy rose bush.
Mm-hmm.
Or you want a tomato plant that yields these massive, perfect red fruits. You want the highlight reel, the stuff that looks impressive from the street.
And that is totally the beginner's eye. It's how our brains are wired. There's this mechanism, it's called the reticular activating system, which essentially filters out anything the brain deems irrelevant.
So you don't just short circuit from too much information.
Exactly. You'd get overwhelmed by sensory input otherwise. So to a beginner, 90% of a garden is just a green wall.
A green wall. I like that.
Yeah, it's just background noise. You only notice that bright red tomato because your brain flags it as the ultimate goal. And this is where Ang is at. When you spend decades observing an ecosystem, just sitting in the dirt day after day, you are actively retraining that neurological filter.
You literally force your brain to dismantle the green wall.
Precisely.
You stop looking at the broad strokes, and you start seeing the structural mechanics of the canvas itself.
Which fundamentally shifts your entire perception of value. Ang has spent so much time observing nature that their interests have just become hyper-refined over hundreds of entries.
Right.
A beginner wouldn't even notice the plant Ang is completely fixated on in part 962. It requires a highly seasoned eye to look past all those showy engineered blooms at the nursery and recognize the profound complexity hiding like millimeters off the ground.
Okay, so let's look at what Ang's seasoned eye has actually found. Because the obsession of the day is this tiny botanical specimen called the Malaysian False Pimpernel.
Scientifically known as Torenia crustacea.
Torenia crustacea, right?
Yeah.
And Ang describes it as a tiny ground-growing plant with paired serrated leaves, tiny violet flowers. And I really need to pause here and challenge this one specific detail. Square stems.
Square stems, yeah.
Wait, square stems.
It is a detail that completely disrupts our standard visual schema of the natural world, doesn't it?
It sounds like a physical impossibility.
Yeah.
If you are hiking through the woods or even just, walking through a local park, every organic structure is a curve. Tree trunks are cylindrical so they can distribute weight. Vines spiral around things, leaves sweep into arcs. If I'm on a trail and I look down and see a perfectly cubic rock sitting in the dirt with sharp right angles, my immediate assumption is that a human being carved it and left it there.
Naturally. Because biology builds in spheres and cylinders, human engineering builds in squares.
Exactly. So finding a square stem in the wild feels like, I don't know, it feels like a glitch in the matrix.
It really does feel like an architectural intrusion into an organic space. But the square stem is actually a brilliant evolutionary adaptation. Yeah, it's primarily found in the mint family Lamiaceae and some related groups. Think about it from the plant's perspective. When a plant is growing incredibly close to the ground, competing intensely for whatever dappled sunlight makes it through the canopy above, it needs to project its leaves outward as efficiently as possible.
Right, to catch the light.
Exactly. But it has to do that without snapping under its own weight.
So the square shape is structural, like an I-beam in construction.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. An I-beam. In these square-stemmed plants, the corners of the square are heavily reinforced with what botanists call collenchyma cells.
Collenchyma cells. Okay.
Right, they are these elongated, really thick-walled cells that provide extreme mechanical support, especially in regions of new growth where the plant is reaching out. By concentrating that structural reinforcement just in the four corners, the plant essentially builds its own microscopic scaffolding.
Oh, wow. So it's saving resources.
Yes. It uses way less cellular material than a solid, thick cylinder would require, but it achieves a rigidity that allows it to push horizontally across the ground and angle those paired, serrated leaves perfectly toward the sun.
That makes so much sense. It's basically an optimization problem solved through pure geometry.
It's incredible engineering.
But Ang doesn't just focus on the architectural oddity of the stem, right? The description moves to the blooms themselves. And Ang asks this rhetorical question in the notes, quote, doesn't this tiny ground-growing plant look like miniature orchids, Torenia, or even snapdragons?
And those specific comparisons tell us a lot about the structural complexity of what Ang is actually observing. Because orchids and snapdragons are not your standard daisy-like flowers.
Right, they're not just a circle of petals.
No, they don't have radial symmetry where you can just cut them in any direction and get equal halves like a pizza.
Right, right.
They have bilateral symmetry. Botanists call them zygomorphic flowers. They have a distinct top and a distinct bottom, often forming these really complex throats or jaw-like structures.
Which are highly specialized landing pads for very specific pollinators, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. It's not a free-for-all buffet for any bug that flies by. It's a vault, and only a certain type of bee or moth actually knows how to unlock it.
And visually, that level of complexity signals high status, doesn't it? Orchids are like they're the absolute divas of the botanical world.
Total diva.
They are prized for this exotic, almost alien beauty, and they usually require immense effort to cultivate indoors. And snapdragons, they are focal points designed to absolutely dominate a ceramic pot on a patio.
Very true.
So Ang is taking that high-status, complex, ornamental visual, that intricate throat, the vivid violet color, and finding it naturally occurring on a creeping, square-stemmed weed that most people would just casually step on without a second thought.
It forces a total recontextualization of scale. We are so conditioned to associate grandeur with size.
Bigger is better.
Right. But Ang is pointing out that the architectural complexity of an orchid actually exists on a microscopic level, right at our feet. It demands that we recognize beauty based on its intricate design, not just its sheer volume.
Which naturally brings us to Ang's actual horticultural goal here.
Yeah.
Because this isn't just an exercise in microscopic admiration, right? Ang notes that they have been exploring ground cover plants for quite some time, and they evaluate this Malaysian False Pimpernel as a, quote, better choice for its blooming.
Right. And we should probably talk about the actual mechanics of ground cover, because I think a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand what it actually does in a garden.
Oh, totally. If you read standard landscaping vlogs, they treat ground cover like an outdoor carpet, like the rug that ties the room together.
Exactly, the outdoor carpet.
Its job is just to be neutral, cover up the bare dirt, be green, and basically just not die. You throw down some ivy and you just ignore it for 5 years.
Yeah, but that outdoor carpet analogy focuses purely on aesthetics. Biologically speaking, ground cover functions much more like an ecological immune system for the garden.
Oh, I love that framing. An immune system. Let's unpack that.
Well, when you have exposed soil, nature absolutely abhors that vacuum. Opportunistic seeds blow in on the wind or birds drop them, and they immediately try to colonize that bare space.
Right.
Ground cover is a preemptive defense against that. A dense, creeping plant like the Malaysian False Pimpernel physically shades the soil.
Yeah.
That drops the temperature and blocks the sunlight that those invasive weed seeds desperately need to germinate.
So it's starving the invaders of light.
Yes. And on top of that, its shallow root system outcompetes new arrivals for surface water and nutrients. It completely locks down the microclimate.
Okay, so a standard gardener just wants an immune system that is purely functional. A wall of plain green ivy to keep the invaders out.
Bare minimum utility.
Right. But Ang, who is operating at the absolute master level of Part 962, is demanding absolute perfection from this utilitarian layer. Ang doesn't just want an immune system. Ang wants a ballooning immune system.
It is a deeply philosophical approach to the space. Ang refuses to treat any square inch of the ecosystem as an afterthought.
Not even the dirt level.
Especially not the dirt level. If a plant is going to be granted the prime real estate to act as the garden's primary defense mechanism, it must earn its keep through extraordinary beauty. Ang wants the heavy, utilitarian lifting of weed suppression performed by a plant that delivers the visual punch of a miniature orchid.
It's the holy grail of landscaping, really. High utility, practically zero maintenance, and microscopic structural perfection.
The trifecta.
Which leads us to the most fascinating problem in this entire deep dive. If this plant is the ultimate geometrically fascinating orchid-like ground cover, how do you actually get it?
That is the big question.
Because you'd assume you just open a catalog from some premium botanical supplier, pay $50 and order a flat of it.
You would definitely assume that, yes.
But Ang states it incredibly plainly in the entry. From what I've read, you don't buy it, you forage for it in the wild. And this is where I really have to push back on Ang's grand plan.
Uh-oh.
Because the proposed solution isn't to go hike deep into an untouched national forest to find this rare gem. Ang writes, perhaps I can harvest some during my field trips to plant nurseries.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but aren't we just talking about trespassing and pulling weeds out of a commercial parking lot? How is this a profound philosophical strategy and not just being an incredibly weird, disruptive customer?
I completely understand the skepticism because honestly, it sounds absurd on its face. Going to a store to scavenge for weeds.
It really does.
But the absurdity is exactly the point. It exposes a massive glaring blind spot in how the commercial plant industry actually operates.
Okay, explain that, because right now it just sounds like a botanical heist.
It is a heist, but it's a heist of something the owners actively despise. Let's look at the actual economics of a commercial nursery. Their entire business model relies on the illusion of absolute control over nature. Right. They spend thousands and thousands of dollars importing, cultivating, and chemically treating plants to ensure they fit a very specific, rigid consumer mold.
They want predictability.
Exactly. They want plants that bloom on a perfectly predictable schedule, that fit neatly into standard-sized plastic pots, and that survive the brutal logistics of the supply chain.
They want standardized products with barcodes on them.
Precisely. To a nursery owner, the Malaysian False Pimpernel is an existential threat to that illusion of control. It is an uninvited, highly adaptable survivor. It ignores the plastic pots completely and just creeps along the gravel, sneaking into the irrigation runoff under the display table.
A rebel.
It really is. It doesn't need their expensive synthetic fertilizers. It doesn't care about their carefully curated seasonal layout. To the commercial market, a plant that thrives without human intervention isn't a miracle. It's a weed. They would literally pay an employee an hourly wage to spray toxic herbicide on the exact plant Ang is trying to carefully acquire.
That is wild to think about. The nursery workers are actively trying to poison the exact specimen that a master gardener with 962 journal entries of experience considers the ultimate prize.
It really forces us to take a step back and ask what a weed actually is. Because biologically speaking, there is no such thing as a weed.
Really? No biological definition?
None. A weed is a purely human construct. It is simply a plant growing in a place where a human being currently doesn't want it to grow. And that is usually because we haven't figured out a way to efficiently monetize it yet.
Ah, so the market dictates that value only exists in what has been intentionally packaged for sale. If it's sprouted on its own for free, it is deemed worthless.
Exactly. But Ang's highly trained eye sees right through that economic illusion. Ang walks into a space designed explicitly to sell nature, completely ignores the heavily manipulated barcoded inventory sitting on the tables, and drops down to harvest the wild resilience growing in the margins.
It's so subversive when you put it like that.
Uh-huh.
Ang is extracting immense value from the exact thing the commercial system throws away in the trash.
It is subversive. The Malaysian False Pimpernel doesn't need to be shipped across the country in a refrigerated truck. It just needs a tiny crack in the pavement to sprout its square, I-beam stems and its bilateral orchid-like flowers.
Yeah.
For someone like Ang, who has spent literally decades studying how ecosystems actually function, that rugged, stubborn independence is inherently more valuable than a fragile, genetically uniform cultivar sitting under a price tag on a retail shelf.
The irony is just so rich.
Yeah.
But the practical application of it is undeniable. Ang is acquiring the perfect, blooming, weed-suppressing ground cover, completely for free, simply because society has collectively agreed to label it a nuisance.
It completely reorients the way you look at a garden center, doesn't it?
It really does. The real treasure isn't on the flashy display rack. It's the resilient little survivor the staff is actively trying to sweep out the back door.
Which perfectly encapsulates the evolution of a true learner. We started this whole deep dive talking about the reticular activating system, how beginners only see the giant, showy blooms that society tells them are important.
The green wall.
Right, the green wall. Ang's journey from part 38 all the way to part 962 is the meticulous process of breaking that conditioning. It is the profound realization that the most structurally complex, highly functional marvels in our environment often exist entirely outside the boundaries of commerce.
We have traveled a massive distance today, from the epic scale of a lifelong journaling habit down into the microgeometry of collenchyma cells in a square stem, and finally, to the wonderfully rebellious act of foraging for unpriced beauty in a commercial parking lot.
It's quite a trip.
It is. And Ang's documentation proves that if you are willing to put in the time to genuinely observe your surroundings, the world is practically overflowing with intricate marvels right beneath your feet.
It is a really potent reminder that we don't always need to go to a specialized retailer or open up our wallets to find something breathtaking. Sometimes the most resilient, beautiful thing in the space is the thing that grew there in absolute defiance of the system.
Which leaves you with a final thought to chew on as you go about the rest of your day. Ang found their ultimate prize growing wildly, completely ignored right in the margins of a commercial space. If the market has failed to recognize the immense value of a beautiful, blooming, geometrically fascinating ground cover simply because it can't be easily put in a plastic pot, what other stunning high-utility things are you walking past every single day just because nobody has slapped a barcode on them yet?